Hi, everybody. Well, for a couple of weeks now, we've been studying Chinese religions, and that includes both Confucianism and Taoism. In the case of Taoism, we're reading a popular work by the author Alan Watts, and it's called What is Tao? That's what I'd like to offer some remarks on in my brief lecture today. Here we have an image of Alan Watts. Alan Watts was born in the UK, moved to the United States, and had a long career as, I guess we would call it today, a spiritual author. He wasn't precisely New Age in the sense that term has acquired over the years. He was a Buddhist practitioner. He was interested in popularizing Eastern traditions, making them accessible to especially Western, especially American and English audiences. Beyond that, though, he was someone with a keen eye for how these ideas, these traditions, apply to actual problems and challenges in our world today. So he talks a lot about technology, he talks about travel, he talks about the stresses of modern life, and in this book especially, how the so-called Taoist way can help us through that. So what I want to do is take a quick walk through the two parts of the book, acknowledging the introduction as well by his son, Mark Watts, and then we'll wrap up. The book itself begins with the first verses of the Tao Te Ching, authored traditionally by Lao Tzu, sometimes called the Lao Tzu, and it bears repeating these first verses. You'll see this differs quite a bit from the version that we read for class. That is because the translations of the Tao Te Ching are famously diverse. The meaning of the characters is quite open to interpretation in an interesting way that is supported by Alan Watts's argument in this book, in fact, keeping it very open rather than trying to nail down a specific meaning. So to revisit the same verses in a different translation is valuable. Let's take a look. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Tao here meaning way. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So we have a Tao that can be told and a name that can be named, but then we have an eternal version of these. Remember, eternal means outside of time. It doesn't mean an infinite quantity of time. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. So in the spirit of Watts's book, we can make a reference to Judaism and Christianity in the book of Genesis, where Adam names all the animals, and those animals acquire that particular the difference from one another through that act of naming. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only the manifestations. The manifestations here would be something like what in the Western tradition we would call appearance, whereas the mystery is something like reality, right? Something that can't be named, it can't be pinned down, it can't be placed into our categories, but we can, in fact, experience it. And this is one reason why the Taoist tradition is so focused on experience. The introduction by Mark Watts, who's depicted here with his father, Alan Watts, of course, on the right, Mark on the left, is he offers a helpful introduction, just kind of walking through some of the main features of Taoism. That's something that Watts doesn't really do in the book, you'll see. He says a little bit about Lao Tzu and a couple of historical episodes, but the book was based on a series of talks that Watts gave at seminars over the last 10 years of his life. His son shares in the introduction. So it wasn't really composed as a standalone book. I mean, Alan Watts didn't sit down and say, all right, here's my book on Taoism, right? It's occasional talks applying Taoist ideas to everyday concerns. Mark Watts writes of his father here, of the book, that his father gives the reader an opportunity to experience the Tao as a personal practice of liberation, free from the limitations of the commonly held beliefs within our culture. And you'll see in the book that's very much what Alan Watts is criticizing, commonly held beliefs within our culture, old patterns of thinking that he thinks hold us back from experiencing the profounder truth, if you want, the Tao that cannot be named, that would otherwise be available to us. Now, there are two parts of the book, and so I've taken the liberty of just reproducing the title page, the section page of part one here, The Way of the Tao. And here he is, Alan Watts, explaining some of the basic concepts, and then the next section will be more on practical applications. We begin here with another selection from the Tao Te Ching. This is from verse 2, so this immediately follows the verse that we looked at above in portion, and this is the first portion of verse 2. So let's take a look at this translation and comment a bit. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Here we can see what the translator, whom I take to be Alan Watts, is doing. When people see, in other translations it says, the beautiful gives rise to the ugly. It's more abstract, right? Here he's referring to actually individual people seeing something beautiful, and by contrast with that thing, other things take on the opposite characteristic. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore, the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. We'll see that this principle of non-action, or Wu Wei, is an important theme in this part of the book and in the Taoist and Confucian tradition, also in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So all of these Chinese and East Asian traditions tend to run together in really interesting and fecund ways. So here's a surprise for you. Alan Watts begins the book by referring to what he calls religious or philosophical art. He starts with landscape painting, which we're getting to presently, but he contrasts this with images of icons. Now, here we have two of the most famous icons in the Christian tradition. On the left, you have the Christ Pantocrator, the Christ creator of all. And I'd encourage you to actually look at only the left half of his face. So like cover half of the face and look at that. And then cover the other half of the face and look at that. And you'll see that there are two very different expressions on his face. The image, the left side of his face, looking at him, the left side of the image of him, is gentle, is peaceful. His hand is up, right, in a kind of teaching gesture or a pastoral gesture. Whereas on the right, if you look only at that side, you see the expression is more severe, it's more dark, it's more angular, right? He's holding a book with the cross, representing the law, the teachings of the church. So here we have an image, an icon that is really influential in Christian thinking. Now, an icon, as Watts describes, is an image that, it is understood, believed by Christians, serves as a way to make contact with something that is not itself the icon, that is beyond the icon. Right? So the icon is an image, an imago, of something beyond it. So in this case, the image is an image of Jesus Christ, and for the believing Christian, this image is an aid to connecting with that further reality. Also, it's an image of a person, of an individual, right? Similarly, on the right side, the image on the right side, we have Rublev's Trinity. Andrei Rublev, a famous Russian artist who painted this image of the three persons of the Trinity. In Christianity, this is typically called the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And the sign of the cross is made to acknowledge those three. This is not a class on that, but the important thing is that this image, it serves, again, as an aid to get at that famously mysterious reality, the reality of the Trinity. How can there be three persons with one nature, right? Three persons in one God. And so here we have examples of iconography, these images that are used as aids in prayer in the West. By contrast, have a look at this image. This is one of the images that Watts refers to early on and expresses great interest in, a landscape painting, Chinese landscape painting. So here we have mountains, and we have water, and we have clouds and trees. And you'll see we also have a boat in the foreground, and we have some houses or some buildings, structures in the middle background. Uh, this picture is quite different than the icons. It does not, Watts insists, look beyond itself. It's not pointing us to a mountain or a river, in a metaphysical sense or cosmic sense. It's not saying that, you should go see this mountain and or river. We don't even know, or at least I don't know, if this uh, corresponds to a real place that the artist saw, or if it was a product of her imagination. So we see the difference between the Western styles of art that Watts introduces and also this Eastern style of art. Whereas the Western style of art is looking beyond itself, right, to something beyond nature. The Eastern style here, this Chinese landscape painting, is not looking beyond itself. It's simply what it is, right? And it's calling for a kind of balance with nature. He aptly begins the book with a section under this title, Our Place in Nature. And that's going to be his theme throughout the book in terms of understanding the importance and the value of Taoist ideas in our, we'll say, Western world today. Let's say in North America, where many of us watching this video are. But if you're not, hello, nice to see you. Alan Watts writes, I've picked out a few quotations that we'll walk through. The contrast in these two forms of expression, the Western and the Eastern art, arises as a result of the sensation that the human being is not someone who stands apart from nature and looks at it from the outside, but instead is an integral part of it. Instead of dominating nature, human beings fit right into it and feel perfectly at home. Watts has, I think it's fair to say, a real allergy to the notion of dominating nature. Of course, that's a rather healthy allergy to have, but he often returns to this theme that in the West, we dominate, we control. He works this out quite a bit in this first section. In the West, he says, we speak of the conquest of nature. We are dominant over nature. And we also mistrust nature, he claims. That's something for all of us to reflect on. Mistrusting nature. Also, we mistrust ourselves, right? Because if we are not quite a part of nature, but yet we have a nature, and talk about human nature in some sense, all of these are complex philosophical issues, then wouldn't our nature itself be somehow suspect? We see in the Christian tradition, our nature is fallen, right? Our nature is faulty in some way. It cannot be trusted on its own. Watts is setting up a contrast here between this understanding of Western traditions and his understanding of the Taoist tradition. I say Taoist, but he's also interested here in Confucianism and makes some reference to Buddhism. I've taken the liberty here of placing as an image on the slide this image of Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha, representatives of the three traditions. And I shouldn't speak too soon. I don't know if it depicts those figures specifically, but these are representatives of what so-called three traditions, three lineages in China. These religions that we think of in such a distinct way, in fact, interpenetrate quite a lot. Both Confucianism and Taoism, according to Watts, believe and agree that the natural world in which we live and human nature itself must be trusted. We are not fallen. The world is not in the hands or under the control of an evil figure, a devil or a Satan figure. The world is, broadly speaking, good. It flows. It's not good according to our moral understanding of that term, but it is what it is. It's not evil. It's not malicious, right? In Taoism, Watts also points out a call to trust the self-so processes that happen naturally. There is such a call. Breath and heartbeat. You don't think about your breathing. You don't think about your heartbeat unless something is wrong with them, in which case you think about them quite a lot. Because these processes happen automatically, we take them for granted. They are self-so, as he puts it. They just are what they are. And to control them brings us into some other kind of activity, the normal breathing. Taoists, he writes, understand the practice of Wu Wei, the attribute of not forcing or grasping, and recognize that human nature, like all of nature, is Tzu Jan, or of itself so. You'll see later in part one that he has discussions of both the concepts of Wu Wei, often translated also here as non-action, the attribute of not forcing or grasping. I'm not trying to get something. I'm not trying to control something. Fits with his first section, and Tzu Jan, or of itself so, that everything is just what it is, right? It's not good or evil. It simply is what it is. And if we can, as it were, flow with that, I hesitate to say flow, it's such a kind of colloquial word now, but if we can just be with that, that is, well, that is the Taoist way. So, how to approach this? How to get at this way that we've been talking about? Because we've drawn a contrast with the West and the East, and now we want to understand it better. The core of Lao Tzu's written philosophy, Watts writes, deals with the art of getting out of one's own way, learning how to act without forcing conclusions, and living in skillful harmony with the processes of nature instead of trying to push them around. Learning how to get out of one's way, act without forcing conclusions, living in skillful harmony with the processes of nature. Skillful harmony. So the goal is not simply to lie on the grass and look at the sky and wait, right? But to live, to engage in your life in a way that we'll see described as the book goes on, but to do so in harmony with nature rather than in a manner of trying to control it. Continues, because of the inseparability of opposites, you realize that they always go together, these opposites, and this hints at some kind of unity that underlies them. He had all of those opposites that we saw in the epigraph, the little verse from the Tao Te Ching at the beginning, beautiful and ugly, right? Being and non-being. Here we have a hint of unity. What is that unity underlying all of those opposites? You guessed it, it's the Tao, right? That is the way. The Tao is itself that underlying unity. Watts writes, so what is the reason why Tao is inexpressible and yet at the same time the basis for a philosophy? This unity, we can't say what it is, it's ineffable, inexpressible. The reason is that we cannot have any system of thought, whether it be philosophical or logical or mathematical or physical, which defines its own basis. To try to say anything about the Tao is like trying to eat your own mouth. And of course, you cannot get outside of it to eat it. Every system, he's pointing out here, and I think very defensively, has presuppositions. It has things that it assumes or takes for granted. Now, there are different kinds of assumptions you could make. I can assume that the world is actually populated exclusively by pink elephants, right? Well, that's not a very reliable assumption. It could be easily disproven the first time you see something that's not a pink elephant. There are far more subtle examples of presuppositions or assumptions, including biases and stereotypes, that are false presuppositions and, as a matter of justice and truth, need to be corrected. However, the point, more basically, is not what those assumptions or presuppositions are, but that they are there. And so the question is, what will they be, right? Will they be something that has a lot of content, that imports a lot of kind of structure into the system? Or will they be something ineffable, inexpressible, like the Tao, simply meaning the way things are, right? This is the presupposition of Taoist thought, not anything more specific than that. Watts's point is that any system needs some kind of presupposition. So how do we live with this? We have a sense of what the Tao is, right? So now we want to start actually doing something with it. Here we have the notion of virtue. And it doesn't mean quite virtue in the way we think of it in the West, but let's have a look at this passage. And on this slide there also we have the Chinese character for te, or virtue. This peculiar Chinese sense of virtue, Watts writes, is called te, but it is not virtue in quite our ordinary sense of being good. Te is like our word virtue when it is used more in the sense of the healing virtues of a plant. When we use the word virtue in this way, it really designates an extraordinary kind of skill at living. And in his book, Lao Tzu says the superior kind of virtue is not conscious of itself as virtue, and thus really is virtue. But the inferior kind of virtue is so anxious to be virtuous that it loses its virtue altogether. Let's look at this passage in two parts. First of all, um, it it's more like the sense of a healing virtues of a plant. So we have a sense of virtue that's connected often with morality or with ethics, right? If I'm a virtuous person, it means I'm good. Now, of course, there are lots of ways to understand that. In an everyday sense, people might think of this in as terms of good according to some set of rules, be it the Ten Commandments or the rules of some organization. What he's saying is that it's not like that. It's more of, and the Western notion of virtue has this too, of a power, right? Of something you can do. Virtus means, well, we get our word virility from that, or strength, right? So a virtue, it has to do with strength. So if a plant has a certain property that enables it to heal you from a certain disease, we could say it has the power to do that. An older sense would be to say it has a certain virtue of doing that. The second part here is really interesting. The superior and the inferior kind of virtue. Okay, let's start with the inferior kind. I'm virtuous. I'm a good person. I know I'm good. I'm always doing good. I'm very concerned to do good, right? In the view of Alan Watts, and also he claims here Lao Tzu in the Taoist tradition, that is not virtue at all. If I have some kind of preconceived idea of what is good and I am just adamant I'm going to be good, right? Nah, I mean, you're following a rule, but that doesn't mean that you're in touch with the Tao, that you're in touch with nature, that you've overcome this desire to control. In fact, it looks rather controlling. By contrast, we have the superior kind of virtue, which is not conscious of itself as virtue and thus really is virtue. So to be truly virtuous, to truly act with this strength, this power, this virtus, right, is to act in such a way that you're not conscious of it. You're not trying, right? You're not trying to be something. You're not playing a role. You're simply acting in a very natural way. This would be the concept of virtue that I see Watts presenting from Taoism. I think this is our last slide from part one, and then we're going to wrap it up by looking at part two. So he says here that we're actually moving. So we've kind of identified the Tao. We have some understanding of what it is, or at least a place that it has in the system of thought. We know what it means to act well, right? To act in accordance with the Tao, Te, call it virtue. But there's a process you go through as you follow this Taoist way, or you can call it Taoist path, right? Watts. In all this, you will see that there are three stages, always three, right? There is first what we might call the natural or the childlike stage of life, in which self consciousness has not yet arisen. Stage one. Then there comes a middle stage, which we might call one's awkward age, in which one learns to become self conscious. Two. So you have before self consciousness, and then the emergence of self consciousness. Very awkward, right? And finally, the two are integrated in the rediscovered innocence of a liberated person. Right? So you start out without self consciousness, you're kind of doing what you're told, you're natural, you're childlike, you're just going through life kind of unthinkingly, not because you're an unthinking person, but because you're a child, you're learning things, right? You're taking things in. And then you become more robustly self conscious and you become aware of future plans that you have, worries, concerns, existential kinds of issues, right? It's awkward. And it's not where you want to really remain. I mean, no one wants to be 13 forever, at least speaking for myself. So the goal is to integrate these two in some way, to recover that kind of childlike naturalness that we had as a child, but to do so in a way that doesn't simply make us a child again, but incorporates, and he uses the word here, integrates, what we have developed of our identity, of our understanding of self, um, through this self-conscious process. So through three stages, we move to what a philosopher, Paul Ricoeur in the West, has referred to as a second naivete. You start out naive. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means you don't know anything yet. You move through a process of criticism, of awakening, of asking questions about everything. And then finally you return to what Ricoeur calls a second naivete, where you go back to this moment, this kind of childlike approach. So that was part one. And now, briefly, part two. He titles this The Gentle Way. We'll see why presently. He begins here on the first portion of this, from the Tao down to infinite possibilities, is from verse 4. And I believe the next one here, the Tao is called the Great Mother, is from verse 25 of the Tao Te Ching. So he's moving around a little bit here, but choosing verses that in his view represent the purpose of the chapter. That's what an epigraph is for, by the way. You know, when you find a little poem at the beginning, or the verse or quote at the beginning of a paper. The Tao, we read in Watts's translation of the Tao Te Ching, is like a well, used but never used up. It is like the eternal void, filled with infinite possibilities. The Tao is called the Great Mother, empty yet inexhaustible. It gives birth to infinite worlds. It is always present within you. You can use it any way you want. I take it to be his choice of these passages. I take his choice to be based on the reason that we're talking about how now do we use the Tao, right? And that's not, again, in the sense of control, which would go against the whole spirit of the thing. But how do we live this out, right? What are the ways in which either we could live it out, or historically people have lived it out? We'll see how he treats that. So he begins here with this notion of the strength of weakness. And this is an image we've heard reference to in our earlier readings, but it's worthwhile to return to it. One of old Lao Tzu's favorite analogies was water. He spoke of water as the weakest of all things in the world, and yet there is nothing to be compared with it in overcoming what is hard and strong. You can cut water with a knife, and it lets the knife go right through. Yet water alone cut the Grand Canyon out of solid rock. And we have appropriately here, I hope, an image of the Grand Canyon. The aim of Taoism is to work with nature rather than to try to dominate and control nature. Thus, this image of water is apt. Water does not press, wu wei, no action, right? Water does not try to do anything. It's not striving and pushing, right? It simply goes with the flow, right? And over time, give it a few millennia, or I don't know, many thousands of years. I don't know how long it took to form the Grand Canyon, and it can do astonishing things that seem impossible. Now we're rocking the GIF or the GIF. Let's go with the GIF. Maybe that's better. Judo, Judo, the gentle way. This is where Watts gets his title. Now, what's happening on our screen over here? Well, let's read the passage and then we can comment on the image. Instead of defending myself, Watts writes, and pushing the blow off, now he's talking about a move in Judo. The idea in Judo is to carry the blow away. The blow is the punch, of course. But as the adversary goes by, the knee goes out, catching him below his point of balance, and the adversary then falls heavy and hard, brought about by his own initiative and your receptivity. By letting him follow his punch through and not deflecting it, he has fallen into your trap. So one thing to do is to block the punch, take the punch, tense your body, right? This is not the way of Judo, according to Alan Watts. Here we see on the image. So we have two fighters here. It looks like perhaps a woman in white and a woman in blue. The woman in blue seems to attack the woman in white, or to thrust toward her, and the woman in white then catches the blow and deftly flips the woman in blue over, such that the woman in white wins. Now, why did the woman in white win? Was she stronger? Was she bigger? Was she faster? Well, maybe faster, but she was, in this particular moment, more deft, more able to receive and channel the energy coming from the woman in blue. Right? This is the strength of Taoism. It's the strength of receptivity, of softness, right? And you'll see Alan Watts goes on about, masculinity and maleness, and this idea of, the hard, strong men, and how within Taoism, there's often been counsel that men should retain within themselves some measure, a certain kind of femininity, and vice versa, that women do well to maintain a certain kind of masculinity. We see this represented in the famous yin-yang symbol, with the dot of the opposite color in the area, respectively white and black. So the balance of these two things is not exclusive. Each contains its opposite in some small measure. We have here a discussion of the word li, and I would draw your attention especially to this because I think it really helps our understanding of Confucianism. You'll recall that we talked about li primarily as ritual. Within Confucianism, you study in order to learn the traditions and the rites, and then you practice the rituals. Right? Now, we discussed ways in which that notion of ritual actually is enlarged in the tradition. It's not only people with incense and robes in temples, it includes that, but it also includes all of the kind of modes of social interaction in which we engage every day. Here we have an expansion of this notion of li that I think is really engaging. We read from Alan Watts, the Chinese use the word li for the actual order of nature. So li here, ritual, actually refers to natural law. This is a peculiar and interesting term. Its original meaning is the markings in jade, the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle. None of them, human-made, right? All of them patterns appearing in nature. It has been translated by a certain scholar as organic pattern, which we've taken as the title of our slide. And here we have the Japanese character for li. Watts, this strange and unintelligible form of natural order is at the basis of everything we do. Is at the basis of everything we do. This is similar to our concept of natural law in the West, or I say the West, I mean around the world. And the natural sciences have a concept of the laws of nature. What are the laws of nature, right? Well, we come to know them through experimental science to a certain degree. We form hypotheses, test them, retest them, and eventually, when it holds up under multiple conditions, we call it a law. But here we have a concept that's not as specific as those particular laws, gravitation or what have you, but it refers to the fact that there is an order in nature, there is a kind of law of nature, a way things go, and that our human activities, both robes in temples and everyday interactions, actually express and fit to and accord with that law of nature. So there's a profound harmony here. It's a harmony not only among people or in a society, right? But it's a harmony that fits with nature itself. And so we see in certain Chinese texts, if the emperor stands and faces north, all the people will live in harmony. Right? And you say, well, why? Why would that possibly be? Well, we have an image here of nature as consisting of this interlocking web of harmonies. And so the action of the emperor, that very simple action, a do-nothing action, wu wei, right? Just standing and facing and being virtuous, having these powers. That action itself is understood traditionally in these traditions to be a reflection of the order of nature. The last main theme in the book here is the book of changes. And we won't go into great detail about this. It is an important part of the Taoist tradition and connected with the Taoist tradition. Watts describes it as an ancient Chinese method of divination. So divination has to do with telling the future or receiving some kind of oracle or message about what is happening in our lives at present. A method of divination that is infused and linked inextricably with Taoism. The kind of question to ask the Book of Changes, the I Ching, as it's called in Chinese, is something like this. What is the best thing for me in my present state? So as Watts points out, you don't ask the oracle, you don't bring to this book of changes a question like what stocks will go up or down, or will I win the lottery? That's not the right kind of question. That you see there's a center of this, it's the yin yang symbol, and then there are these 8 trigrams. Trigrams? I think they're called trigrams because they're the 3 bars, right? And Watts goes on for several pages about the coins and how by flipping these coins in a certain combination, he goes into some detail about it, you're able to kind of read your trigrams and then correlate them with what is in the Book of Changes in these 64 combinations. Now, on the one hand, here's the thing I'd like to focus on about this, and it's what Watts goes on to focus on. He talks about a Western view and an Eastern view, right? Now, the Western view would typically be, what's this mumbo jumbo, right? Like, yes, there's some old book, and if you flip coins in a certain way, you can get bars in a certain pattern, and then fit them to the book. This is like a horoscope. This is like kind of old wives' tale, to use the old phrase. That is a Western view. But there's also an Eastern view, and there's a way of bringing these things together that Watts advocates. The whole worldview represented by this form of divination fits with this harmony with nature that he's been on about since the very first page of the book, right? So if you look at the Book of Changes and you say mumbo jumbo, right? You are actually exhibiting your own beholdenness, your own enthrallment to certain assumptions characteristic of Western modern scientific culture that closes out possibilities about anything that doesn't fit within that world view. And Watts wants us to open up those possibilities. He thinks that Taoism is offering a better way. And so we come to our conclusion, and he's back to nature. Remember, the first section was called Our Place in Nature. Well, he's back. We have come to terms, Ellen Watts writes, with nature by wooing her rather than fighting her. Here he's talking about the Taoist way. On the Taoist way, we woo nature, we don't fight her. And instead of holding nature at a distance through our objectivity, as if she were an enemy, realize rather that she is to be known by her embrace. In the end, we must decide what we really want to know about. Do we trust nature, or would we rather try to manage the whole thing? Do we want to be some kind of omnipotent God in control of it all, or do we want to enjoy it instead? What kind of relationship do we actually want to have with nature? Last bit. It was well said, the mystery of life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. The mystery of life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. This is, I think, an apt line on which to conclude our brief remarks here on Alan Watts's book, What is Tao? Life is not a problem, and death, I think, is no parenthesis. That's an E. E. Cummings quote for the fans out there. The conviction at the heart of Alan Watts's book is that we can, in fact, through this Taoist practice, through cultivating virtue in this sense, not a moral virtue, but this kind of power, this harmony with nature, by following the way, right? We can live in a way that we experience that underlying reality. And that is what is called the Tao, right? Not all of the things that have names, not all of the opposites that structure our thinking and our world, to a degree necessarily, but something underneath all of those things. Not instead of all of those things, but underneath them. And something which, if we do connect with it, we can return to all of the named things and all of the opposites in a new way. And we can experience them not with that initial naivete and not with that kind of biting criticism, but with a second naivete, an integrated view of the world made possible by this Taoist tradition, in the view of Alan Watts. All right, everybody, thanks very much, and I do hope that you enjoy your reading of this book.